Hey everybody, welcome back to VBU series, A Defense of Christian Belief. I'm calling today's segment, Jesus Christ as a Historical Reality. Now let's remember, previously in this series, we've been under the large umbrella sub-theme of the existence of God, and now we're moving on to part 2, an umbrella sub-theme of why Christianity. I really hope you get to see those previous segments. There's 8 segments based on natural theology or general revelation, not special like the Bible, but general revelation as classical apologetic support for why to believe there is a God. In those segments, you'll see that I made inference to an eternal first cause being who is intelligent, conscious, personal, and moral. In fact, we looked at reasons which infer the best explanations to describe this being that we would call God would not be polytheism, many gods, or not pantheism, God and nature are one. And in fact, concerning this God, we also inferred that self-revelation would not only be plausible, but expected. So when we think of one God who self-reveals, we would obviously land on the 3 major monotheistic one-God religions, that being Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. Somebody that we've had at our church, Dr. Craig Hazen, in fact, he's been here twice, director of apologetics program at Biola University and Talbot Seminary. He's the editor of Philosophia Christi Journal. He's spoken all over the world on this subject, and Dr. Hazen answers the question, when investigating theistic religions, why start with Christianity? And he makes a very solid case. I'm going to give you just 3 of these reasons that he gives. One is very simply that Christianity makes objective, testable claims. Now that might sound funny, but there are many religions that actually don't make objective, testable claims. A very great example in the New Testament of the Christian Bible, 1 Corinthians 15:17, Paul says, "And if Christ is not risen, your faith is futile." In fact, this is really a pretty incredible claim. It's one that really doesn't fit the common narrative about religions in general or what people say about Christian faith. See, the claims of Christianity are based on the premise that there is a being, a real person, a human who existed and who performed works, one known as Jesus Christ, who lived in actual time, space, history, and was involved in objective historical events. And so this person, these events, are subject to investigation. In fact, to give you the Karl Popperism, they are actually falsifiable. A lot of people don't realize this, but compare this just to Islam. In Islam and the Quran, there are actually no miracles attributed to Muhammad. Some later sources say he performed them, but even many Muslims reject those as authentic sources. The Quran is said to have been given to Muhammad by an angel. Muhammad's the only witness. The path of testing the truth claims of the Quran is just simply a very subjective personal experience of reading it and experiencing its elegance. This is similar to the claims of the Latter-day Saints or Mormonism about the Book of Mormon. Well, how do you know the Book of Mormon is true? Well, you read it and you experience personally the burning of the bosom. Now, keep in mind, Christianity in no way negates personal subjective experience. I could give testimony of ways I think I've sensed God revealing himself to me personally, but in just comparing that experience to another, Christianity doesn't just land only on that. Again, look at what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15. If Christ is not risen, meaning historically, meaning previously in time, space, history, he says to believers, he says your faith, meaning your personal subjective faith experience, is futile. It's vain. So keep this in mind. Christianity is based on evidence and is grounded in history. A great example is in Luke chapter 1. The historian, physician, and author Luke says this. In chapter 1, verse 1, he says these events about Jesus and his life, they were fulfilled among us. In verse 2, he says, those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses. Notice he says there's multiple witnesses. Notice that he's doing a historical investigation and basing it on those witnesses. And in verse 3, he says to this one Theophilus, I'm writing to you an orderly account. And in verse 4, he says it's that you may know the certainty of these things. He doesn't just say so you'll read it and have an experience. He's essentially asking Theophilus to accept this as solid historiography. In fact, Craig Hazen writes, Jesus parts company with other religious people who make untestable spiritual claims. Closely related to this is Christianity as testable. In Christianity, Craig Hazen says, you don't need to succumb to a divided story thinking. Somebody who famously spoke to this was the late Francis Schaeffer. And he talked about how there have been existentialist thinkers who tried to categorize religious thinking and truths as different from other kinds of truths. So in other words, when you think about Christianity, you don't even need to try to be reasonable. Now step back and ask yourself, does the person holding to that claim to be saying something reasonable? It's like, are you saying it's reasonable to not try to be reasonable? Again, you give in to self-refuting statements. In fact, for many Eastern religions, reason is actually thought of as a barrier to spiritual progress, and that's unlike Christianity. The Bible teaches in Jesus' own words, we love the Lord our God not only with our heart, but with our minds. Dr. Hazen says this, Christianity provides a solid basis for human rationality, while other positions of naturalism, postmodernism, pantheistic monism, they struggle to make sense of human cognitive faculties altogether. So, why start with Christianity? Christianity makes objective historical claims. In Christianity, you don't need to have a divided story thinking. Also, Craig notes that Christianity hinges on Jesus Christ. Now, that might seem obvious, and someone might ask, well, what's the point of saying that? Well, as Hazen and others point out, it's as if every other religious worldview sort of wants a piece of Jesus. In fact, Detective J. Warner Wallace, Atheist Become Christian, when he was at our church, he has gone through summaries of what other religions think of Jesus. And in just a whirlwind of this, Hindus believe Jesus was a holy man, a wise teacher, is a kind of God of some kind. Buddhists believe Jesus was an enlightened man, a wise teacher. Various New Age stripes believe that Jesus was a wise moral teacher. In fact, even many Muslims believe he was born of a virgin, he was to be revered and respected, he's a prophet, a wise teacher, he worked miracles, ascended to heaven. Even many Jews believe he was Mary's son, he was a teacher, a rabbi, had many disciples, performed miracles, claimed to be the Messiah, crucified on a cross. They would even concede his followers reported him as raised from the dead. Think of it this way. It's like Jesus is the caboose on everyone else's train, whereas for Christianity, he's the engine. So why not start there and examine this engine? Why not investigate the one that's revered by virtually every other religious tradition? In fact, Jesus himself sets himself up for this in the gospel account. He says at the location, Caesarea Philippi, and I've been at that location. It's a location where there was just a pantheon of religious belief in Jesus' time in the first century. I actually played a little gig there on my harmonica with two other people. But it's there where it's recorded, Jesus asked the question, who do men say I am? And then he asked his disciples, who do you say I am? It only makes sense that everybody would at least first come to an understanding of who do you say Jesus is. So again, I'm calling this segment Jesus Christ as a historical reality. Thinking of Jesus as a historical reality, I'm going to look at several points related just to the subject of history and then relating that to Christ as a historical reality. So, number one, I'm going to look at history and objective reality. Now, by objective, I mean that it's true for everyone, whether you believe it or not. That means objective as opposed to purely relative. Relative meaning relative to or dependent on merely an individual's perspective. In fact, one author puts it this way about relativism. He calls it a stream of philosophy where for 200 years it started as a trickle, but then it became this roaring torrent. In fact, he says it affects almost every discipline and every aspect of culture. As Dr. William Lane Craig notes, certainly history has been affected by this stream, this avalanche of relativism. He says in studies of history, people succumb to what's called non-realism. And what they mean by that, it's the view that all we can have are historical reconstructions of the past. We can't actually really come to terms with the past itself. Now, if you take that to its logical extreme, you can end up thinking that we're in like this dystopian George Orwell 1984 existence, where history is just whatever you make it to be. But Craig also notes that in our time, there's just pure non-objectivism or subjectivism in history. And this means, this view holds, that no historical reconstruction can legitimately claim to be superior to alternative reconstructions. Think about that. No historical reconstruction can claim to be superior to any other reconstruction. Now, people will claim this in some form of postmodern relativistic view, but they actually defy that in their everyday life and practice. I'll give you an example. So suppose that you and someone went to see a couple movies, or you watched them on Netflix. Suppose you watched the movie Lincoln by Steven Spielberg, which is an attempt to be very historical about the figure Abraham Lincoln. And then suppose the next day you saw the farce Tim Burton's film, Abraham Lincoln, Vampire Hunter. Imagine if I asked you now, which one was more historical? You'd say, well, that's just ridiculous. I mean, the second one is obviously way out there. It's a fringe reconstruction. How can anyone take that seriously? Well, no. See, according to this subjectivist view of history, no reconstruction can claim to be superior to alternative reconstructions. In fact, Dr. Craig writes, all real, genuine historians are going to distinguish between good history from poor history. In fact, there's an example of somebody who claimed to be a historian. His name was Immanuel Velikovsky. He actually attempted to rewrite all of ancient history based on worldwide supposed catastrophes caused by extraterrestrial forces. And in doing this, he reconstructs all of ancient history. He dismisses entire ancient kingdoms, languages. He throws all that out as fictional. And so as you can imagine, there's actual archaeologists and historians like Edwin Yamauchi. He's at Miami University, Oxford, Ohio for years. He just meticulously tore this guy's hypotheses apart. He says Valesky, he's definitely a catastrophist if he says his history is a catastrophe. But the thing is, historical relativists can't be consistent with dismissing him. They have to concede that Velikovsky's views are as good as anybody else's. The way Craig puts it is, the reaction of historians to Velikovsky proposals, they're very hostile, and so in criticizing poor history, the relativist has to acknowledge the objectivity of history. So when we find that there is a grounding that's objective for history in objective reality, number one, we come to number two, objective history as an actual discipline. There are actual disciplines for testing history. You can call it testing a historical hypothesis. Again, Dr. Craig, like other objectivist historians, will note there are methods that differentiate between objective fact and fiction in history, and these would include tests like logical consistency, ability to explain the evidence. Craig says that, and basing this on the author Behan McAuliffe, he says the scientist can test his proposed explanation by performing experiments, and so the historian will test his by seeing how well his experiments elucidate the historical evidence. So, as we apply the discipline of objective history to the Christian, just the New Testament, what do we find? So we get to this subject, number 3, the Christian New Testament as history and documentary evidence. So, evidence for historical accuracy includes documentary or written evidence, and there's just typical tests that can be applied to this. And these include several subjects. One is primitive manuscripts. Primitive just means very old. Primitive manuscript tests means, do early manuscripts of the documents even exist? Another one is quantity and quality. Do these primitive manuscripts have sufficient quantity and quality, and are these accurately reproduced? Another one is internal consistency. Does consistency exist within the contents of the text itself? Do they corroborate with each other and with extra biblical history? Another one is time proximity, and this is a big one. How does the date of writing compare with the time of the events themselves? I'm going to look at just a couple of these in just a brief way, because this could be a very, very extended study in and of itself. We might have a whole series on this in VBU in the future. But letter A, consider the subject of the New Testament and the test of primitive manuscripts. Now, I'm going to give you 7 ancient works, and I'm going to tell you how many primitive manuscript copies there are of each of these ancient works, and then I'm going to compare that to the New Testament. So, the ancient playwright Aristophanes, number of primitive manuscript copies are 10. The famous ancient philosopher Aristotle, primitive manuscript copies 5. The ancient philosopher Plato, number of primitive manuscript copies 7. The ancient historian Suetonius, number of primitive manuscript copies 8. Tacitus, the historian, number of primitive manuscript copies 20. Sophocles, the playwright, number of primitive manuscript copies 100. In fact, the most documented ancient secular work is Homer's Iliad, which survives in 643 primitive manuscript copies. Now, some of these have a genre of writing that isn't claiming to be historical, but when they do, the general historicity of these are not called into question. But compare all of these above with the New Testament. The New Testament has over 5,600 primitive Greek manuscripts in existence, and that's even a conservative number. You can see by comparison on this premise, on this plank, the New Testament shines in the test of primitive manuscript copies. Okay, what's another test, though? And again, this is a big one. The New Testament and the test of time proximity. What this means, again, is how does the date of writing of these manuscripts, of these original autographs, compare with the time of the events themselves? One of the ways that historians have compared this in biblical writings is the time proximity and dating by the book of Acts. In fact, there are numerous evidences that point out that the book of Acts had to have been written at least prior to AD 70. If it was, by the domino effect, this would push the writing of the date of, first of all, Luke, because Luke, Acts are the same author, and one just followed the other, and Acts refers to Luke as the previous book. And then at least two others of the gospel, Mark and Matthew, are commonly considered by all historians to be earlier than Luke. A classical Roman historian, Colin Hemer, cites 15 reasonable evidence for Acts being written between not only before AD 70, but between AD 60 and AD 62. I'm not going to give you all 15 of these. I'm just going to give you 4 of Hemer's reasons. One is a huge one, that there is no mention in the book of Acts of the crucial event of the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Another one he gives, number 2, there's no hint of the outbreak of the Jewish war in AD 66 or a serious deterioration of relationships between the Romans and Jews before that time. Number 3, there's also in the book of Acts no hint of the deterioration of Christian relationships with Rome during the Neronian persecution of the late AD 60s. Also, number 4, there's no hint of the death of James. This is James, the half-brother of Jesus, the church leader, not John's brother. No hint of his death at the hands of the Sanhedrin in AD 62, which is recorded in Josephus. Think about this. This is material that the author of Acts would likely include, not only because they're significant events of history, but because as a Christian author, you could say this fits into his gun. The Gospels predicted the fall of Jerusalem from Jesus' own lips. Why would they not include that in the book of Acts? They didn't include it. The obvious explanation is it hadn't happened yet. So, time proximity and the writing of the New Testament by the book of Acts. Another way that we study time proximity and dating of the New Testament is by what are called creeds and hymns. So a brief explanation of this is that scholars of New Testament texts, Christian, non-Christian, in higher academia, they generally agree that there are sayings in the New Testament which are written in such a way that they are like mnemonic devices. Keep in mind, this is a very oral culture. And so they would use these for memorization. They're considered part of oral traditions that were passed down, and they give, because of that, every indication that they predate the time of the writing of the text itself. One very famous one is 1 Corinthians 15:3. 1 Corinthians alone by itself is a very early letter. Even secular historians agree to that, and it being genuinely Pauline, written by Paul. But in 1 Corinthians 15:3, Paul says, "For I delivered to you, first of all, that which I also received." And going on, it speaks of the very important core Christian truth of Christ having died, that he was buried, that he rose again. He presents names of witnesses, 14 by name, and then in general 500 to the risen Christ. Somebody who's done extensive research on this, Dr. Gary Habermas, says virtually all serious scholars who've studied the subject agree in this passage the Apostle Paul recorded an ancient creed or tradition regarding the death, resurrection, and appearances of Jesus. In fact, he says this proclamation actually took place long before the date of the book in which it appears. And there's several different evidences of this. Inside the text itself, the terms delivered and received indicates that it was passed on orally, likely, to the Corinthians and to Paul. There's also parallelism and stylized content, which indicates that this wasn't arranged this way first by Paul. There's also a number of non-Pauline, non-Paul type words used, and there's also the use of the Aramaic name Cephas. For this and other reasons, several astute historians throughout history, Ulrich Wilkins, a German scholar and professor, he declared this creed to be indubitably going back to the oldest phase of all in the history of primitive Christianity. Joachim Jeremias said this. He said, "This is the earliest tradition of all." Habermas says most honest scholars, if they provide a date as to when Paul received this teaching, they go back to as far as this being received as 2 to 8 years after Jesus' crucifixion. This would place it at roughly AD 32 to 38. Another respected historian, German historian Hans von Campenhausen, he calls this report and this account as meeting all the demands of historical reliability that could possibly be made of such a text. Now you stop there and you may not realize the importance of just this section of Scripture, that 1 Corinthians 15 alone sinks countless numerous conspiracy theories and ideas that exist in the World Wide Web today. One very famous one is called the Da Vinci Code. There was a book written about it. There was a movie made about it. It was based on what's called Holy Blood, Holy Grail. I have copies of both of those. The argument is that these ideas about Jesus, like him dying for our sins and rising again, those were just decades and decades of legendary development. In fact, they go so far as to say the Howler, that they maybe just came up with these at the time of Constantine in AD 325, hundreds of years later. No, absolutely not. 1 Corinthians 15, 3 and 4 by itself sinks all of those conspiracy theories. Whether it's true or not, we find out from those verses that the earliest testimony about Jesus was, yes, he died for sin, and the testimony was that he rose again. They did not come up with that 100 years later. Has anybody ever been convinced by these things and flipped their position? Yes. I want to look at this theme of time proximity and how a scholar flips because of the evidence. John A.T. Robinson, by the late 1970s, he had a reputation of being what some call a very liberal Bible scholar. He had a role in what was known as the Death of God movement. In fact, in 1976, though, coming off of this, he dropped a bombshell book called Redating the New Testament. And after detailed, extensive research, Robinson concluded that all of the books of the New Testament were written before AD 70 and by their traditional authors. In fact, blowing their minds, Robinson even ended up dating the New Testament books earlier than the dates of his conservative peers. In fact, it was so early, his dating of the books, that it would have meant that one or two of the Gospels could have been written as early as 7 years after the crucifixion, and at the latest, they were all composed within the lifetimes of eyewitnesses and contemporaries of the events. This is why someone like the late John Warwick Montgomery, a brilliant historian and law professor, I had a chance to hear him speak. I met him in college, and he died just this year. But Dr. Montgomery says this. I want you to remember this. He says, to be skeptical of the resultant text of the New Testament books is to allow all of classical antiquity to slip into obscurity. He says, for no documents of the ancient period are as well attested bibliographically as the New Testament. Now keep that in mind. I'm going to return to that in just a bit. Remember what we're doing here is we are applying the discipline of historiography to the Christian New Testament. We've applied the test of the New Testament and primitive manuscripts. It comes out shining, especially comparatively. We've applied the test of the New Testament and time proximity. And comparatively even, I didn't go into many comparisons about how so many people that we assume existed and we assume the basis of their life, that their biographies are written hundreds of years later. But now we're going to apply letter C, the witness of extra-biblical antagonists of New Testament Christianity. What I'm going to give you is a list of 12 sources who are not even believers, but as antagonistic or at least indifferent to Christianity, they witness very early on to the existence of Christ, certain details of the events of his life. I'm going to put on the screen the dates of their existence and of their time of writing, and then I'm going to go through these 12. One is all the way back to the first century, Thales. Another first century author is Phlegon. Then, of course, there's the Jewish author from the first century, Josephus. Then moving into the second century, there's Tacitus, there's Suetonius, there's Galen, there's Celsus, there's Marabar Serapion, there's the Jewish writing, the Talmud. There's also Lucian, Galerius, and Pliny the Younger. In fact, some of these give more explicit details than others about Christian events as to what Christ and Christianity were about. I want to give you just 3 of those. In the Talmud, the collection of writings by Jewish rabbis, it actually states that Yeshu, the Hebrew Aramaic word for Jesus, was put to death on the eve of Passover because he practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. That's like a Jewish version of who this Jesus was. Tacitus, the Latin historian, writes that Christus, named after the person, Christians, right after the person Christus, a Latin word for Christ, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilatus, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, broke out not only in Judea, the first source of evil, but then even in Rome. Pliny the Younger, governor of Bithynia in northwest Turkey, in the early 2nd century, from a letter written about 111 to the Emperor Trajan, references the blasphemy of Christianity. He says this, he says, these Christians met regularly before dawn on a fixed day to chant verses alternatively among themselves in honor of Christ as if to a god. So, that's from extra-biblical antagonists or those indifferent to Christianity. Now I want to move to letter D, and I want to consider the remarkable witness of extra-biblical friends of New Testament Christianity. There is an early church author and martyr. His name is Justin Martyr. And he refers to the expression that they pierced my hands and my feet, that was used in reference to the nails of the cross which were fixed in Jesus' hands and his feet, and that after he was crucified, they cast lots upon his vesture, and that they crucified him and parted among him. And he says this, that these things did happen, you can ascertain, and he refers to this really ancient work called the Acts of Pontius Pilate. And this is not the fabrication of the same name, but this is the one that was from a report from Pilate to Tiberius based on the minutes from a senatorial meeting, is his reference. Now, also in general, there are the church fathers. Concerning just the 4 Gospels, there are 19,368 citations from the church fathers dating from the late 1st century onward. This includes people like Papias. He was a companion of Polycarp, who was a disciple of the Apostle John, and Papias quotes John. And from this fact, the argument's made that the Gospels were in existence before the end of the 1st century. In fact, it's even been noted that there are enough quotations from the early church fathers alone that even if we did not have a single copy of the Bible, scholars could still reconstruct all but 11 verses of the entire New Testament from material written within 150 to 200 years from the time of Christ. So, once again, we're testing historically the objective reality of the truth of the New Testament. We looked at history and objective reality. 2, objective history as a discipline. And then 3, what we've been on, the Christian New Testament as history, including documentary evidence. But now I want to look at the Christian view of New Testament as history, geographical and archaeological evidence. Now, there is so much that can be addressed on this subject. I've been to Israel. I've stood at sites that corroborate with biblical truth. But I want to look at some things within the text themselves, very briefly, that corroborate with archaeology and history. We're going to look at the book of Acts and then very briefly the book of John. In the book of Acts, once again, Colin Hemer, classical Roman historian, he chronicles Luke's accuracy in the book of Acts verse by verse, and with very intense detail, he identifies 84 facts. 84 facts in just the last 16 chapters of the book of Acts that have been confirmed by historical and archaeological research. Similarly, with the Gospel of John, Dr. Craig Blomberg confirms 59 details. 59 details from the Gospel of John that have extra biblical and archaeological corroboration. In fact, you can see where they are going from this, that from this, if you get these details that seem to be just arbitrary and matter of fact correct, why would they not get the actual aspects of their stories correct? If they were only intending to write legend, why would the intended legend have just these passing details that corroborate with archaeology, geography, and history? Now, people very commonly push back on that and say, well, that just doesn't prove anything. We have what's called a scientism way of looking at our world, where if it's not empirical scientific research, then we can't know anything. And so, okay, I don't like using the word prove in a purely scientific or mathematical sense, but if you really examine the subject of historiography, which is what some call the science of historical investigation, when you look at arguments based on manuscript evidence, internal consistency, time proximity, and archaeological evidence, when you apply those to the New Testament scriptures, this overwhelmingly, the historiography overwhelmingly supports the position that we have no reason to doubt the New Testament's basic historical credibility. Now, lest we're going to be skeptical of the importance of history at all when verifying the activity of revelation of God represented by Jesus Christ to humanity, keep in mind, in a technical sense, any event which takes place in our time-place existence becomes history once the event is over. Keep in mind that if Jesus' cross and resurrection event took place, let's say right here in the United States, and took place last week, we would face most of the same questions about verification. Are there reliable witnesses? How many? How committed are they? Are the testimonies corroborating? What was their motive? We do that every day in what we call the court system. Even in our day of video technology, well, I have a video of it. Was the video doctored? Who took the video? Can the person be trusted? Can the person be trusted that they didn't recreate it with some kind of AI technology? That's why in a summary manner, I'm going to give you 3 summaries on this from sources. One is the historical scholar R.T. France. France says, we have seen above sufficient reason to be confident that the Gospels not only claim to be presenting fact rather than fiction, but also where they can be checked, they carry conviction as the work of responsible and well-informed writers. Paul Meyer, longtime professor of history at Western Michigan University, Think about this. He says many facts from antiquity, they rest on just one ancient source. He says while 2 or 3 sources in agreement generally render the fact unimpeachable. I want to go back to Dr. Montgomery's statement. John Warwick Montgomery says, to be skeptical of the resultant text of the New Testament books is to allow all of classical antiquity to slip into obscurity. Someone would almost have to get to the point, if they land on this kind of skepticism, to say, if we can't know these things from these sources, how can we know anything about ancient history? Or you might take it the next step, how can we know anything from history? And as anyone well knows, now that we have witnesses dying off of, let's say, the event of the Holocaust, what do we have people doing? Challenging whether the Jewish Holocaust in Nazi Germany ever actually happened. This is a very fringe version of what we can ascertain and how we can ground claims from history in objective reality. In fact, a great example of this from modern time. Dr. William Lane Craig, in a public forum at Iowa State University, this is the university where both my daughter and son-in-law both graduated. Dr. Craig was in a debate with a skeptic, a religious studies professor, atheist, who rejects all the Christian truth claims about Jesus. Craig, in his debate, pressed him on this subject of history because the individual just kept saying, well, that's not good enough, that's not good enough, that's not good enough. And finally, Craig says, can we know really anything about ancient history? To which he realized the implications of what he's saying. And at least in the debate, he said, no. Now think about that. One thing for certain is that he doesn't really believe that. We can't know anything from ancient history? No. We can't know that Alexander the Great had these conquest? Can we even know that Alexander the Great was not a vampire hunter? If you hold to that route of skepticism, that fringe version of relativism, you end up realizing you're renouncing pretty much everything, not only in ancient history, you could even say in recent history. But people don't do that. Can we just get realistic on this? When people are engaging in actual life, they don't set out to say that I've got to have all of these documents. You have to prove, well, no. I mean, if somebody's on trial, we assume that they're doing objective historical research and they're coming up with witnesses, evidences, whether somebody's guilty, not guilty. Luke Johnson, professor of history at Emory University, he speaks to what we can affirm just from some core basic truths of documents, both biblical, extra-biblical, using the Bible even as just thinking of it as ancient literature. As Christians, we affirm it's more than that, but it's certainly not less than that. And Johnson, like many others, affirmed just a core basis of history about Christ and the events of Christ. And Johnson answers, in fact, the skeptics of the 90s Jesus seminar. He answers them in a book. The book is called The Real Jesus, The Misguided Quest for the Historical Jesus and the Truth of the Traditional Gospels. He wrote this, again, from the perspective of examining the extra-biblical sources and using the New Testament merely as just ancient literature. And Johnson says this. He says, even the most critical historian can confidently assert that a Jew named Jesus worked as a teacher and a wonder worker of some kind in Palestine during the reign of Tiberius was executed by crucifixion under the prefect Pontius Pilate and continued to have followers after his death. So from there, we start asking some other questions. One question is this: in doing historiography, why did this Jesus continue to have followers? Didn't others make claims that, yeah? So why Jesus? Why the explosion of the church? Why is he still to this day the most influential person in the history of humanity? That's what we're going to explore next time when we're going to be on the subject, the resurrection variable. Did Jesus rise from the dead? I'll see you next time here at Valley Baptist University.